Please welcome host of the Rubin Report, Dave Rubin.
Guessing more of a sativa crowd. Is that right? Indigo, that was not an indigo ovation. An indigo ovation would have been very slow. That was very nice. Are you guys excited to see Jordan Peterson tonight? There is some crazy energy going on in this country right now. I think you can feel it. It's like everyone seems like they're going completely bananas. And these shows have become basically refugee centers for sane people. There's just a few of us left. It's like The Walking Dead. Everyone else is zombies, and we're here together to talk about ordering chaos. I should tell you guys before we start, because you know one of the rules is about being truthful. I was actually not Jordan's first choice to open for him on the tour. That was very nice. No, naturally that was Kathy Newman. And yeah, he asked her to open for the tour. He called her, he said, Kathy, you know, let's let bygones be bygones. Why don't you join me? 2 million books sold. Come on the tour with me. She said, so you're saying you want to sleep with me? All right, you guys get all the references. I'm very impressed so far. You're all there. How many of you cleaned your room today? That was the first time I think in 50 some odd shows that people raised their hand. You guys are very respectful around here. That's the thing. You also answered at once too. All right. Very respectful people. There is something going on. I think you guys can feel it. That's why you're here. I assume you guys are on board this whole intellectual dark web train. Are you on board the dark web? Yeah. The beauty of this thing, of course, is that it's about diversity of ideas. You know what I mean? There's a certain meme out there that we should care about diversity of skin color and sexuality and gender, these immutable characteristics, that's fine, but it doesn't matter. It's about diversity of thought. Now we've got, you know, people on the left like Sam Harris, we've got people on the right like Ben Shapiro, and now we have our new leader, Kanye West. So, Kanye, he's going to be president. It's pretty obvious to me at this point. Like, how much more bananas can the whole world go, right? He's going to be president. But, you know, as we're doing this tour, 50 some odd cities, it's been incredible. We're meeting thousands of great people like you guys. Although, pretty much every day, including today, there's a hit piece written about Jordan every day that we're doing this. And it's always like completely insane. The big one last month was the enforced monogamy. You saw that one in the New York Times? Jordan's for enforced monogamy. It's just marriage, people. That's it. And yes, it can be quite horrific, but that's all it is. That's all it is. But we thought, you know, we should probably embrace this, right? Because it's exhausting fighting the hit pieces all the time, so we decided to embrace it. So we thought here, tonight, we would enforce a little monogamy. You guys down for that? Yeah? All right. Here's what we'll do. How many single people do we have? Single people. Okay? One very enthusiastic single person. Something kind of a group of singles over there. Okay, we got some single people. Now the thing is, and you have to work with me here, usually these audiences skew a little more male than female. It's usually like 60-40. So we may be enforcing some gay monogamy. Is that cool? Got one yeah over here. I'm gonna need one more. Wow, that was a lot of people at once. Everyone wants in on it. Yeah, it's pretty great. All right, guys. Jordan Peterson is right over there. He's wrestling an 800-pound lobster right now. He's right over there. All right, before I bring Jordan out, I want to do one other thing. So when we started this tour, 3 or 4 months ago, we were in Jordan's adopted hometown of Toronto, where he was a clinician, a professor for many years, and someone tweeted me something that I thought kind of captured everything that's going on here. Now, normally, when I open up Twitter, it's a pink anime fox telling me to go fuck myself, but that was a very honest laugh. I feel that, but I see there's some pink anime foxes here. But it was not a pink anime fox. In this case, it was a guy by the name of Immeasurable Matt. He took a picture of him and his girlfriend or his wife, and he wrote, "It's wild to be sitting in a sold-out venue with 1,000 other people waiting to listen to Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin when in my daily life, I act like a secret agent and tiptoe around even mentioning Jordan Peterson's name." Look around, guys. There's something great happening. There really is, and you know, most revolutions, they come with a lot of blood, but if we do this thing right, there won't be any blood because of the good ideas that this guy's putting out there. So give it up for Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Thank you very much. How about that Portland traffic control, eh? I was talking to Dave. He thinks that we should have a meeting in Portland and discuss such things sometime in October or November. Him and me and some of the other people in what's been called the intellectual dark web. It might be interesting to discuss the limits of behavior on the left and right. It might be a useful thing to discuss. All right, so I use these lectures as an opportunity to think on my feet. I try to do something different every night. And that allows me to, you know, it's thematically related to what I've been working on all along because, well, I can only think what I think. And so I have these ideas that I've been working on for decades that I laid out in 12 Rules for Life, for example, and in my YouTube lectures, but I'm always trying to push them farther than I've developed them to get a little bit clearer about what I'm talking about and to distill it more and to make it more communicable. And so this is a great way to spend an hour and a half thinking and then also to watch how that thinking is working because we're having a discussion, I can watch how everyone is responding, I can listen to how the audience is responding, I can see if I'm on track with regards to what I'm saying, because if I'm on track then people will listen, they don't shuffle around, you can't hear a lot of audience noise and people are nodding and paying attention, and I can tell that by watching. It's a good thing to know if you're public speaking, you know. First of all, you never talk to a crowd because the crowd really isn't there. Besides, if you talk to the crowd, then you get nervous. You talk to people in the crowd, individuals, and you know how to do that because you've talked to individuals your whole life. And so if you understand that the crowd is made up of individuals, then you can talk to people one at a time, and then you can tell if they're paying attention. And that's kind of scary because maybe they're not. And so it's easier to hide in your PowerPoint or to read your notes or whatever and not to communicate with the audience, but it's a real wasted opportunity because you have a chance to see how your ideas are working in real time. And you can use that to position yourself properly, and that's very helpful. So I thought what I'd do tonight is like briefly just review the 12 rules that I laid out, kind of get warmed up, and then I'm going to introduce a 13th rule, and I'm going to talk about that. And so the first rule in 12 Rules for Life was stand up straight with your shoulders back. And that's what I was trying to express in that essay was a specific idea, and the idea was that your best bet, all things considered, was to straighten yourself up and expose yourself to the onslaught of experience the same way you might expose yourself to an audience when you're speaking. You know? Because that's actually the best possible way of dealing with the catastrophe of life, is to accept it and to face it courageously. And that works. And one of the things I've learned as a clinician, for example, but also as a thinker, is that life is harsher than people think, generally speaking. It's certainly harsher than they want to think, and people are a more powerful force for evil than people like to think, but also for good. But that's only part of the story, because as terrible as things are, all things considered, if you're willing to confront them voluntarily and forthrightly, then you can prevail. And what that means is that no matter how terrible things are, and they can be quite terrible, there's something inside of each of us that's capable of responding to that and attaining victory both practically and psychologically. And so out of that pessimistic view that the world is a tragic place and that it's tainted by malevolence, comes an optimistic conclusion, which is there doesn't seem to be any limit to how strong you can become if you're willing to confront the challenge head on. And I swear to you that that is the fundamental finding of clinical practice over the last 100 years. If you had to distill it, everything that clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, and so forth have learned about helping people move towards a healthier mental state, that would be the rule. That voluntary confrontation with what frightens and upsets you makes you stronger. And that there doesn't seem to be a limit to that. So that's a good thing. That's rule one. Rule two is treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. I'd like to emphasize the responsible part of that. I was just backstage. I like to look up the etymology of words. And it's it's so interesting the way words develop across time. If you know where they came from, it sheds new light on what they mean. And since words are very powerful things, it's often useful to go back and have that light shed on them. Like I learned a while back that the word phenomenon is from, I believe, the Greek phanestai, which means to shine forth. That's really an interesting idea. It's associated with the fact that when you walk through life and you look at the world, that certain things announce themselves to you. You notice some things. They're highlighted against the background, and that's those things shining forth. And that happens, it doesn't happen as a consequence of your voluntary will. It sort of happens to you in some sense. And responsibility is like that too. Responsibility is related to the word response, logically enough, right? But you don't think of it that way. You don't think of responsibility as a response exactly. You might think about it as something, a burden that you take on. But responsibility is a response. And so we'll keep that in mind as we walk through this lecture tonight. To be responsible, to treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping, means that, well, you're responding to the fact of your existence. And you're responding to the fact of your existence. You choose, let's say, voluntarily, to respond to the fact of your existence as if you have intrinsic value. And so then you don't treat yourself nicely, because that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It doesn't mean you let yourself off the hook, or you treat yourself mercifully, although perhaps that's also useful. It means that you respond to the fact that one of the central ideas of our culture is that each person has intrinsic value, and that you therefore have a moral obligation to act as if that's true for you, even if you're not very pleased with yourself. And people are often not particularly pleased with themselves because each person has unique insight into their own shortcomings, and the catastrophe that their life is sometimes by accident, but sometimes because of what people have done. Everyone makes mistakes, and you can make mistakes that really put you in a terrible place, and everyone does that from time to time, and some people do it all the time. And it's very difficult to forgive yourself for that, and observing that you do that, then it's very difficult to treat yourself as if you're someone responsible for helping because you don't think that you deserve to be helped. And, well, there's some truth in that some of the time, but a more fundamental truth is that there's something about you that's of intrinsic value and that you have a responsibility to maintain a relationship with that, regardless of what your opinion about yourself might be from time to time. You know, you might not be very happy with how your child acts from time to time, but that doesn't mean you stop conducting yourself, if you have any sense, like you're trying to lay out a world for them that's the best for them, right? And if that's a great attitude to bring to bear on yourself, if you can manage it. And then rule 3 is make friends with people who want the best for you. And you can modify that rule a little bit. I think you can make it more accurate. It's not as elegant in its phrasing. It's more like make friends with people who want the best for the best in you. That's a better way of thinking about it. There's the therapeutic idea that Carl Rogers developed that you should have unconditional positive regard for your clients. And I thought a lot about that rule as part of establishing a therapeutic relationship. You might even think about it as something that's necessary for even having a really profound and deep conversation with someone that you care for. You know, that you have unconditional positive regard for them. But I never really liked how that was formulated. I thought instead that, because when I meet people and they're troubled, sometimes people come because their life has fallen apart through no fault of their own. They've been laid off at work because the economy tanked, and maybe at the same time someone in their immediate family has got some terrible disease, and one other terrible thing happens, and so they're just laid low, and then they come and talk to me because, well, they're feeling terrible about it, but also because they need to figure out what to do. It's not really a psychological issue at that point, it's more like a practical issue, right? Sometimes the reason that you're depressed isn't because you're depressed, you're in pain and anxious because your life is so complicated and horrible that you can't manage it. And that's not the same as being depressed. But sometimes people come and see me and they're out of sorts because they are actually out of sorts. They've made mistakes. They've committed sins of omission. They failed to do things they needed to do, or they did things they shouldn't have done, and the consequences of that haven't been good. Then you see someone like that who's fragmented, and part of them is working towards what's good for them and for other people, but part of them isn't working towards that at all. And there's an internal war. And, I mean, that's true of everyone to some degree, right? That's the battle between good and evil that wages in every heart. But some people are much more split and fragmented. And so you can't really have unconditional positive regard for them in some sense because they're not one thing. They're like 15 things all fighting. And what you want to find is the core part of that person that's moving up towards the light, let's say, and you want to align with that. That's what you want. And then, you know, and that's really what you want to do if you're picking your friends, is you want to, and I think this is actually a moral obligation, not something to make your life easier, is that you want to surround yourself with people who want the best for the best in you. And like I said, that isn't to make your life easier. That's so that it's because you need everything you can working for you in order to move you forward on the proper pathway, because it's difficult. And you might think, well, why is the proper path difficult? And it's partly because, well, you have to take the future into account, and you have to take everyone else into account while you're plotting your actions. And that's not the same as seeking impulsive pleasure. That's rule 7. Do what's meaningful and not what is expedient. Right? It's harder to do that because you have to balance everything, and that's difficult. You have to take everything into account. And that puts strict restrictions on what you can do moment to moment. You can't just follow your whim. You can't just do what's impulsively pleasurable. I mean, much as we like to, that's often why we drink alcohol, right? Because alcohol is a drug that increases the probability that we'll pursue impulsive pleasure in the moment. And pretty much everybody finds that a relief. You know, and it's no wonder, because it's very difficult to carry the weight of the future along with you every time you make a decision. But it doesn't matter whether it's difficult, because you need to do it. Because if you don't do it, then your future goes to hell, and unless that's where you want to be, it's not a very good strategy. So, rule 4 is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. And that's, I think, the way. And this is something I derived from my training, at least in part, as a behavioral psychologist. Behavioral psychologists are very, very practical people. They're trained practically. So if you're a behavioral psychologist, and someone comes to you with a problem, the first thing you do is you talk to them about what the problem is, because you want to delineate it. Like if you have a problem, it's not like it's simple, it's complicated. So you have to take it apart, and you have to break it into its constituent elements, and you have to come up with potential solutions for each of the sub-problems. And then you have to plot a course into the future. You have to have a discussion about that, because who knows what your future should be, right? That's a real mystery. And you want to test that, and then you implement sort of micro strategies to turn the unbearable present into the positive future. And you set the situation up so the person is very likely to succeed. Not 100% likely, but quite likely. Say, well, okay, here's a baseline for your behavior. You know, maybe you stay up too late at night. You know, and it's interfering with your work. And God only knows why you do that. Maybe you have bad habits, you're not disciplined, you're attracted to something online, it's pornography, it's video games, it's a reflection of the fact that you're undisciplined, it's a reflection of the fact that you don't like your job, it's a reflection of the fact that you're embittered about the world and would rather hide. I mean, God only knows. Those things can be unbelievably complicated. So, but practically speaking, what you do in behavior therapy is you establish a baseline. It's like, okay, well, what time did you go to bed on average each day in the last 2 weeks? It's like, well, 3:30 in the morning. It's like, okay, let's say, how long do you think it should be before we manage to fix this? It's like, what's a reasonable time frame? How about 4 months? How about 6 months? Yeah, and let's say, well, when do you want to go to sleep? Well, you know, 1 o'clock would be a lot better than 3 o'clock, and 11 o'clock would be better than 1 o'clock. Well, let's start with 1 o'clock, and maybe we'll see if we can hit that 4 months down the road. And then that would be, well, then you have to go to bed on average 5 minutes earlier every week for the next 20 weeks. It's not much, you know. It's a small movement, but the trajectory is good. You use yourself as a baseline, right? It's like what you're trying to be is better than you were. Then you don't have to be jealous of someone else. That's helpful, because one of the problems with pursuing an ideal is that if you see that ideal manifested in someone else, you know, then you feel insufficient in relationship to them, and maybe jealous as well, which is it's not an effective cognitive strategy. Let's put it that way. Right? That's the pathway of Cain and Abel fundamentally. But it's hard to have an ideal without feeling insufficient in relationship to it or becoming jealous. But if you use yourself as a baseline, then it's a perfect control, because you're the only person who has exactly the same problems you have. And so you're a fair comparison. You could maybe be a little better tomorrow than you are today. That's a lovely way of thinking about the world, you know, because it puts up something to aim at. Better, that's something to aim at. And then it makes it what would you call it? It makes it practically achievable. Because it's a high probability that you could find some dimension along which you know perfectly well you're not living up to your potential in relationship to, that you would in fact improve slightly, and that would work. You can find that. And so that's one of the things actually that I really loved about being a clinical psychologist when I had an active practice, was that, you know, you could inevitably, not always, sometimes you'd end up dealing with people who were so fragmented they couldn't aim up. You know, you'd aim up on one dimension, and they make some progress, but then some other part of their life would go downhill so badly that it would obliterate all the gains on that particular dimension. That's often when that happens, you have to go deeper. You have to find out what it is that's driving them towards destruction, because mere practical progress won't do it, and it's not necessarily the case that you'll be successful. But it's better to start with simple strategies first, and that incremental improvement strategy, that's a very good one, and it's rewarding too, you know, because you want to set it up. You think about this is what you should do if you have children too. You want to set it up for yourself. You want to think, well, if you're going to progress along some dimension, you figure out what constitutes progress as far as you're concerned. It should be something that you would be motivated to achieve. And you have to have a little dialogue with yourself to see if that's, you know, if that's an implementable solution. It's one of the things you do with people in therapy. It's like, okay, what are we aiming at? Like, things aren't good for you, and we're figuring out why that is and what it means that they're not good. We get that all delineated, and we say, well, hypothetically, it could be better, and somehow, what would better mean? Hypothetically. And then what element of that better would you find motivating enough to put some work in? And you've got to have an honest discussion with yourself about that, because you know, so often you'll try to pursue something that's better and you won't do it. It's because you have some vision of who you are that's romanticized, and you think, well, I'll just lay out a plan that'll improve my life and then I'll go do it, and you don't. And part of the reason you don't is because you're not being honest with yourself. You know, it takes a fair bit of humility to be honest with yourself, because generally speaking, it's only possible to make incremental improvements, and it's very hard on your pride to admit that you're the sort of creature that can only advance incrementally. But man, incremental advancement is unbelievably powerful because it compounds across time, so it turns out that that's why humility is useful. If you can really see where you are and what mistakes you're making, and you're willing to lower yourself enough so that you could find an ideal that would actually work for you with all your flaws, say, well, that is a high enough ideal so that it would even motivate someone like me, you know, with all my flaws. That's great, you're on the right path then, and you can make small progress upward, and that starts to feed back positively. That's a very cool thing. That's a reflection of something called the Matthew principle. It's an economic principle. It's derived from a statement in the New Testament. Christ tells his followers, to those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Very, very harsh statement. And it means this, essentially. If you start to fall apart, you spiral downhill very rapidly. It's not linear. You make a mistake, and then you make 2 mistakes, and then you make 4 mistakes, and then you make 8 mistakes, and then you fall off the edge of the earth. But the corollary of that is that if you do one thing right, it increases the probability that you'll do the next 2 things right, and then that increases the probability that the next 4 things will work out. And so, although on the downside you pay for it by approaching the cliff and falling off, on the upside things can move forward very rapidly once you start the ball rolling. And so, even if it's only incremental success, then it doesn't matter because it compounds. And so that's a good thing to know. And it's a good thing to know because it can help you value incremental progress of the sort that you might be likely to actually undertake much more highly. And that can fill you with a certain amount of hope. It's like, yeah, well, you mean I can make a small improvement? To be like 1/10 of 1% better tomorrow than I am today on one dimension of my life, which is about the right thing to aim at, I would say. It's about that small. I think, yeah, well, you compound that over 5 years, man, you'll be a completely different person. You know, and it's really true. I've seen this happen with many, many people. It really is. It really does work. So that's so cool. That's part of the reason that humility is a religious virtue. You know, because if you're the humility in the psychological sense is to knock yourself down hard enough so that you can see exactly where you are. And that's rough, man, especially when things aren't going well for you. But then if you can get a good handle on where you are, then you can start to plot a course out of it. And that actually works. So, but if you're deluded about where you are and you insist upon maintaining a delusion that places you in a much better position than you actually are, then the probability that you can plot a course forward is 0 and you're not going to get anywhere. In fact, it'll work counterproductively. That's rule 5 is don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And yeah, I like that rule. It's nasty rule, that one, because it's predicated on 2 assumptions. One is that children can be dislikable, and everyone knows that because you were all children at one point, and there were children you disliked. So you knew that ever since you were tiny, and of course you probably know children that you dislike, and maybe they're even yours. Certainly, that happens more frequently than people would ever want to admit. The fundamental idea of that chapter, it's an idea that's associated with responsibility as well. I would say parental responsibility, and it's predicated on the idea that your fundamental obligation as a parent is to help guide your children to become maximally socially acceptable. I do believe that that's what the developmental literature indicates, that between the ages of 2 and 4, children move from egocentric and often quite aggressive and self-centered, that's part of egocentrism, unable to share, unable to engage in reciprocal interaction, unable to play games with other people, unable to forego instantaneous gratification, to 4, when they can do all of those things if they're properly socialized. And if they can do those things, then other kids like to play with them, and if other kids like to play with them, then other kids will socialize them. So, and if you can add to that a little bit of respect for adults, that's a good thing. Why? Well, why should children respect adults? It's like with all their flaws, I mean the adults. You know, that's sort of the romanticization of childhood. There's an implicit perfection about children. Why should you subordinate that to the arbitrary whims of adults? It's like, well, here's a reason. Why should you teach children to be respectful of adults? Well, how about because they're going to be adults? If for no other reason, right? I mean, you're only a child for a fifth of your life, if that. So you're an adult for 80%. If you have no respect for what you're going to become, why would you ever grow up? And if you wonder why people don't grow up, well, that's the answer. That's Peter Pan. You know, why would you grow up? Why would you trade Peter Pan for Captain Hook? No one would do that. Well, Captain Hook isn't an adult. He's just an embittered coward who's chased by his own mortality. And that's not a useful target for adulthood, but that isn't necessarily what adulthood has to be. And so children should respect adults because the adult is their destiny, and if they don't have a destiny that's respectable and admirable, then they have nothing to aim for. And with nothing to aim for, you have nothing to live for. And so that's not a good thing to do to your kids. Not to say, also to say even at a lower level, let's say, less profound level, adults hold all the cards. If adults are good to your kids because your kids behave in a manner that makes them acceptable, adults generally like children unless the children do things that, you know, adults will give children the benefit of the doubt unless the children do things that destroy that. If you help your children manifest themselves such that adults will give them the benefit of the doubt, then adults will open doors for them and teach them things and welcome them and smile at them and be good to them. So then you can have children who can play with their peers, who are welcome play partners, desirable play partners. That's a huge deal. And who are also positively viewed by adults. Well, if you do that, by the time your kid's 4, you're pretty much done. All you have to do is hang around for the rest of their time. And they'll have some questions that they can come to you with. You know, then you don't have to helicopter around them. They'll come to you if they have problems, but mostly they're ready to go. And they can take their place in the world. Rule 6. It's another rule that has to do with responsibility. That's set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And that's an interesting one. So here's the genesis of that rule, at least in part, was something I read in a book written by T.S. Eliot. It was a play called The Cocktail Hour, or The Cocktail Party. Doesn't matter, it's the same thing. And in this play, a woman comes to talk to a psychiatrist at a party, and she says, I hope you can help me. I'm having a terrible time of it. My life isn't going well. She says, I hope it's my fault. And he says to her, well, what do you mean? What do you mean you hope it's your fault? And she says, well, I've been thinking about this a lot, you know, and here's my options. I'm having a terrible time, and maybe that's because the world is a wretched and miserable place. In which case, I'm done, because what am I going to do about that? It's like, if that's the structure of reality and I'm just experiencing it, I'm not going to go out there and change the entire world. That's an impossible task. But if it's me, and I'm doing something wrong, well, then maybe I can fix that, and then it would be fixed. So I really hope there's something wrong with me. And I think that's a variant of humility, let's say. You know, if your life isn't everything it could be, and it probably isn't, you know, although maybe sometimes it is, and people are often satisfied with their life, at least in large part, but, you know, very few people are fortunate enough, careful enough, blessed enough, all of those things, to have everything around them going optimally well. It's like, well, is there something that you could do to change that would make things better? It's the proper go-to position. And I think for a variety of reasons. One is because what's in your control, now that's a good thing. The next is, you probably do least harm in the world by trying to rectify your own behavior. You know, and a least harm strategy with regards to problem solving is a pretty good strategy. It's one of the things that makes me intellectually conservative in some sense by temperament. One of the things you learn, not by temperament, by learning, one of the things you learn as a psychologist who's a scientist who does experiments, who say looking at trying to generate clinical interventions that are positive, is that it's very difficult to develop large-scale sociological interventions that have a positive outcome. It's unbelievably difficult. You think that you can because your intentions are good, and so you trust your intentions, and perhaps you shouldn't even do that, because what makes you think your intentions are so good? You know, it's you've got good intentions, all those other people that don't. It's like, no, that's not very likely. I don't think that's very likely. And then you think you have the problem conceptualized properly, but you don't, because almost every social problem is unbelievably complicated and has multiple reasons driving it, and all the reasons are complicated too. And if you think you're fortunate enough to have put your finger right on the prime reason, and you've come up with the solution to that problem, and you've implemented it properly without making any mistakes, and the net outcome of that is going to be positive, then well, you're basically deluded. Which is why, well, this is certainly the case. Like if you talk to social scientists who are worth their salt, one of the things they'll tell you is, do not make an intervention without putting aside money in your budget to evaluate the outcome. Because the outcome won't be what you think it is. And so, but no one ever does that because, well, people think they know what the problem is. They think their intentions are sufficient. They think their intervention will work. And then they gather a lot of good feeling from believing all that. And the actual outcome is so complicated to calculate and so difficult that it's easy just to leave it at bay. It's very dangerous to do that. It's better to conduct small-scale experiments on yourself, I would say. You have control over that. And the thing is, it works. You know, one of the things I learned with my wife, this is a useful, practical hint possibly, is if we were locked into an intractable argument, which happened many times, and I think, like, there's no relationships without intractable arguments, because unless you happen to marry your identical twin, you know, because you're not the same, so you're going to clash, and you should clash, because who knows? How do you know you're right? You have a problem that comes up in your life. How to discipline your children? Okay, that's a big problem. You know, and you have some ideas about how that might be, but you don't know if you're right, and your partner is going to agree with some of your ideas and object to others. Maybe they're right. So there's going to be clashes. There's going to be clashes about household finance. There's going to be clashes about career. There's going to be clashes about romantic behavior, about friendship, about everything. Because you're different, and because those things are really complicated. Right? And so if you have an intimate relationship with someone, you face the complexities of life. And if you don't disagree, then you're not thinking. Because thinking is disagreement. And so you can get locked into an intractable argument, you know, and then you easily fall prey to the temptation to want to win the argument, to defeat your partner, right, so that you can be right. It's a very dangerous temptation because, well, let's say you're right all the time. Because maybe you're better at arguing. Maybe you're more stubborn, maybe you're more underhanded, maybe you're more devious, maybe you're more verbal, maybe you're meaner, maybe you're better at playing the victim. God only knows what your strategies are for victory, but let's say you win most of the time. So what does that mean for your partner? That means they lose most of the time. And what does that mean for you? That means you're married to a loser. Well, you might think that's fine as long as I win, but it's not really fine. It's not a good long-term game. You know, if you play that for 15 years and your partner loses 80% of the time, there's going to be hardly anything left of them. Of course, then you can like slump around and complain about the fact that you're married to this loser and, you know, benefit from all the sympathy that you get for being a martyr. But God, it's a pretty second-rate game as far as I'm concerned. You know, it might be better to see if you could be married to a winner. In which case, that means you have to let them win some of the time. Or maybe, that's not a good way of thinking about it. I don't mean let them win. Maybe it's help them win. You know, like let's say you're better at arguing verbally than your partner, which doesn't mean that you're correct, by the way. But what that might mean is that you have to help them formulate their arguments better. Because maybe they're right, you never know. As unbelievable as that might be, you know. It's conceivable that they have something to say. Well, you know, and that's useful too, because with regards to this issue with children, if you want to help your children not do things that are dislikable, it's good if you're a communicative unit, the two of you parents, so that the child faces an integrated and solid front, because children are really good at lots of things. They're conniving little rascals, and they can definitely play one parent off the other, and absolutely will. And not only Will they do that? They should do that, because the child's job is to test, right? It's like, well, where's the rule? Where's the rule? Where's the rule? Where's the rule? And you might say what the rule is, but they want to see that you act it out, because they really want to know what the rule is. They want to see that it's solid. Then they'll accept it and pull away from it. But if the rule moves around, then they'll just worry that thing to death. They'll just play with it and torment it forever. And so that's part of what I try to do in chapter 5, is say, look, come up with some rules for your kids. Not too many. You know, because the excess generation of rules becomes burdensome. It's a good rule of thumb for political behavior. No unnecessary laws, but enforce the ones you have. Right? So you want to keep them to a minimum and enforce the ones you have. And those are good rule of thumb principles, not only for a family but for the state. Rule 6, so that's put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. It's like, well, you know, if I was arguing with my wife and we didn't get anywhere, then we developed this sort of routine where we'd separate. That was not easy, because, you know, when you're in the throes of a fight, you don't want to separate, you want to fight, and you want to win. And so it's hard to pull yourself away. And then the rule was, well, you go in your room and I'll go in my room or some other room, and sit there and think this, okay, I know I have to deal with this person, and they're bloody impossible, and clearly they're completely wrong in this situation, and deserve to suffer for it too. And I'm the one to do it. But there's some vague chance, 1 in 1,000, that I did something stupid in the last 6 months that increased the probability of this argument slightly. What was it? Well, that's a horrible question. You know, if you ask yourself, this is the thing, this is the funny thing about prayer. You want to know how to pray? That's easy. Pray to learn something you don't want to know. You'll get the answer just like right now. It'll come so fast in the guise of truth. And it'll help you too. But it won't be what you want. That's for sure. And so if you play this little game, some memory will come floating into your mind. You think, oh yes, I did that nasty little thing. And that increased the probability that we'd be locked in this fight. And then you go tell your partner how you're stupid, and they can tell you how they're stupid, and then now that you've both admitted that you're stupid, which was what you were trying to prove to the other person to begin with anyways, then you don't have to, you know, engage in fisticuffs to quite such a degree. And so it is useful, I believe. And it's a funny thing too. This is a strange thing. So imagine that you're voluntarily trying to figure out how you're at fault. Now that's not the same. It's not the same as involuntarily figuring that out. You know, because depressed people, for example, they feel like they're at fault for everything all the time. But that's not voluntary. That's part of the condition of being depressed. And I'm not suggesting that you should be depressed and think about how horrible you are all the time. It's not helpful. But to do it voluntarily is different. It's like to say, okay, well look, there might have been something I did to contribute to this situation in a negative way. And perhaps if I knew what that was, then I could rectify it. And so that's the upside of that line of thinking. Because at the same time that you can admit that you did something wrong, you admit that you're the sort of person who can admit that they did something wrong. So that's a really good thing. That's a plus on your side. And you also set yourself up to do something about it. And so by admitting that you made a mistake, you show yourself that you've got enough courage to admit that you made a mistake, and then you can hypothetically fix it. So now you've showed yourself that you're the sort of person who could admit that they made a mistake and fix it. And that's a hell of a good thing to comprehend in the throes of an argument. It's like, yeah, I did that wrong, but here's a little incremental improvement I could make that would decrease the probability that I'll do that stupid thing again in the future. By the way, this is a good thing to know. Psychologically speaking, if you have a memory that's older than about 18 months, that's a good rule of thumb. There are neurological reasons for this, by the way. And when you bring the memory to mind, it still upsets you. It means that you haven't dealt with the memory. Now, here's what I mean. The first question is, what's the purpose of memory? And you might say, well, the purpose of memory is to remember the past. It's like, no, that is not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to represent those things that happened to you in the past that were negative, in such a way so that you don't repeat whatever it was that produced the negative outcome in the future. So imagine that you're a surveyor and you're out surveying property, and you want to know where the hills are and the valleys and the fences and all of that. And the reason you want to do that is because the next time you visit that territory, you don't want to trip over fences and fall into holes. Well, that's exactly what you're doing with the memory. It's like, well, here's a bunch of things that happened and the outcome wasn't good. Okay, so what do you need to do with that memory? You have to figure out what it is that you could do, if anything, so that if the same circumstances arose in the future, the same bad thing wouldn't happen. That's it. That's the goal. And if you still have negative emotion about the past event, what that means is that the part of your brain that generates negative emotion is not convinced that you understand what happened well enough so that you can avoid it in the future, and that's why it's torturing you with it. Because the negative emotion systems, there's specialized neurological systems, they're set up to protect you. And they protect you by signaling danger. And so if you remember something that was dangerous because the outcome was bad, and you still feel the threat, it means that system hasn't been convinced that you have a plan. And the plan obviously has to be, like let's say you were betrayed in your previous marriage. And so now you think about that, and you're angry and upset and anxious about it. And so it's like, well, why? It's because you don't know what happened. And because you don't know what happened, it'll probably happen again. And so it's no bloody wonder that you still feel upset about it, because you should, because you don't want it to happen again, because it's a catastrophe. And so if you take it apart, you think, okay, here's the inflection point, here's some things I did wrong. I mean, you're not necessarily omniscient about this. You go back and analyze the situation, you think, well, here's some things I could have done differently. Those are hypotheses, right? Like every plan is. You move forward into the future with a plan. You don't know you're right, but you have a plan. It's like a map. You do your best, you map it out, and it's way better to have a plan than not to have a plan, even if it's not that great a plan. Well, we all know that, and the clinical evidence for that, by the way, is overwhelming. And so, the part of your brain that produces negative emotion wants to know that you have a plan that's derived from a careful analysis of what happened to you in the past. Just for the sake of practicality, by the way, I have exercises online at a site called selfauthoring.com, and one of them is called past authoring. What it does is invite you to write a structured autobiography. Say, go break your life into 6 sections. I don't care, do it any way you want. Outline the most emotionally significant events in each of the sections, and walk through the consequences. That'll free you up like you wouldn't believe. It'll help put you where you are now, because it'll stop you from being tangled up with things in your past that are still embittering you and making you angry and making you old. That's the other thing. I mean, lots of things make you old, and it's hard to escape. But you can age more rapidly or not, And one of the ways that you age more rapidly is by carrying more baggage than you should. And the reason for that is that if you have a lot of undone business in the past, your brain assumes that your present environment is dangerous in proportion to those unresolved issues. And then it produces stress hormones to protect you, to prepare you to act rapidly in the face of that danger. And those stress hormones drive you physiologically past your point of tolerance and make you old. And so it increases the probability that you'll fall prey to all of the diseases of aging. And so it's very useful to go back and clean house if you can, so that you can tell too if you're in a situation like this, if you suffer from reminiscences, that's the Freudian term, it's direct from Freud. If you find that your fantasies move into the past, if you find that you're living in the past, it's because you are. You're stuck there. And the reason for that is you haven't figured out how to reconfigure your behavior so you won't keep having the same stupid things happen to you. And I'm not saying they were your fault. You might have suffered betrayal at the hands of someone truly malevolent. That happens. But it doesn't matter, because the part of your brain that's responding to the fact that that's a threat is not going to quit responding until you figure out how to deal with the fact that malevolent people exist. And that might mean you have to become quite profound, because to deal with a world where evil is an actuality means you have to be quite philosophically sophisticated. And maybe you can't be, maybe you don't have the intellectual breadth for that. Too bad for you. You're just going to suffer. Well, it is. It's like it's not fair. It has nothing to do with fair. It's like you've been set a very difficult problem, and if you don't solve it, then you have the problem. Fair or not, it's completely irrelevant. Doesn't matter in the least. So that's worth thinking about. It's also worth thinking about the fact that it's very hard to plot your course forward into the future unless you know where you are. And if you're stuck in the past, then you're not in the present. You're scattered. Your soul is scattered across time. That's a really good way of thinking about it. And until you gather it together, that's atonement, right? Which means at one. Atonement, that brings you all together. And then you can, if you're together, well, then you know where you are, at least to some degree, and then you can plot a course forward. Otherwise, you're scattered everywhere, and you can't navigate. And so, well, that's rule 6. And rule 7, that's do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. And one of the things I've learned, this is one of the great things that I've learned, I believe, partly from my studies of archetypal stories and literature and so forth, but also from the studies that I conducted on how the brain works, is that we have an instinct for meaning. We have a deep instinct for meaning. And meaning isn't something arbitrary. It's not something you think up. It's something you discover in the world. And your whole brain is set up, in fact, to enable that discovery, because meaning is the instinct that guides you through life. And so if you find something meaningful, this also assumes, by the way, that you're abiding by rule 8, which is tell the truth, or at least don't lie, because if you don't abide by that rule, then you pathologize your neurological functioning, and then the instinct for meaning goes astray, and then if you follow it, you fall into a pit. So if you want to know why not lie, that's why. Because there's all sorts of unconscious mechanisms that operate underneath your conscious cognitive strategies. And if you practice to deceive and become expert at it, you pathologize the unconscious mechanisms, and then they will lead you astray. And if you think that through, you should think about that for about 6 months. If you think that through, it'll scare you badly enough so that you'll try not to falsify things anymore. Because you think about that. You don't want to build automatic machinery in the back of your mind that in a moment of crisis will guide you in the wrong direction. And that will absolutely, 100% certainly happen in precise proportion to the degree that you practice to deceive. So that's very much worth knowing. If you have this instinct for meaning, because meaning is a strange thing, you can't make it occur. It isn't like you can force yourself to find something meaningful. It's that you interact with the world, and now and then you do it in a meaningful manner. It's like it's an independent phenomenon in some sense. And then if you pay attention to that, if you see when that's happening, then you can start to practice to make it happen more and more often. And then you can live in this area of meaning that's circumscribed. And that's a good thing, because I don't think you can live without suffering, and I don't think you can live without subjection to malevolence. But you can live with both of those things being a reality and live in meaning. That's a possibility. And I would say as well that if the meaning is deep enough, then that's the antidote to the suffering and the malevolence. And it's a real thing. It's a powerful enough thing so that what's your best bet? It's what you've got. You know how that is. You know how that works, is that if something's meaningful, then one of the things that it makes you think when you're engaged in it is this is worth doing. You think, well, that was worth doing. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, it was worth making whatever sacrifices you had to make in order for it to happen. That's one thing you mean. It means that it was worth whatever misery was occurring simultaneously while it was occurring. That's also what it means. And so at a fundamental level, to find something meaningful is to find a mode of engaging with the world that justifies the fact that you're vulnerable and that life is characterized by suffering and malevolence. And the deeper the meaning, the more the justification the more the spontaneous justification for the vulnerability and insufficiency of life. And so that's bloody well worth knowing too, as far as I'm concerned. There's a statement in the Gnostic Gospels, if I remember correctly, which were discovered in like 1947, I believe, ancient manuscripts that had been buried for thousands of years. I think this is from the Gospel of Thomas, which isn't a biblical document. It was suppressed. It was one of the non-canonical Gospels that was suppressed by the emergent Christian church, back in 200, 300 AD, or a long time ago. Christ says, the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, but men do not see it. And I believe it's a direct reference to the phenomenon that I've just described, is that if you watch how you conduct yourself in life, you can find times when what you're doing is intrinsically meaningful. And it comes upon you. Like, you don't notice while it's happening. You sort of notice afterwards that was worth doing. And you think, aha, I found something worth doing. Why? What was worthwhile about it? What was my attitude? What were the circumstances that made that occur? Why did that come about? And you think, I should do everything I possibly can to make those circumstances come about as often as they possibly can. Like that's the pearl of great price, right? That's what you would never sell if you could buy. So that's the idea of meaning. I covered Rule 8. Rule 9 is assume that the person you're listening to knows something you don't. Why? Well, it's not necessarily because they're a font of wisdom. You know, so that's not it. It's not an injunction to overvalue the person you're talking to, or to undervalue them for that matter. It's more of a plea with regards. It's more of a practical suggestion about how to ameliorate your own insufficiency. So it's a humility issue again. It's like, well, you know everything you need to know. Well, how do you know? Well, is your life everything it should be? Is it everything you could conceive that it could be? No. Well, then you don't know enough. Well, so what do you do about that? Well, you could learn something. Who could you learn something from? Someone else. Maybe. Why? Because they know things you don't. You know, one of the things I loved about being a clinician, and one of the things I got good at, I think, was that I could have very rapid conversations with people. You know, when people would come into my office, I could get them talking, no, that's not the right way of phrasing it. I could pay attention to them in a manner that made them comfortable about talking to me about things they wouldn't talk to anybody else about almost instantly. And part of the reason for that was I really wanted to hear what they had to say. You know, because one of the things I learned about doing therapy was that if you actually have a conversation with someone, virtually everyone is so interesting you can hardly stand it. If you can get people actually telling you what they think, it doesn't mean you have to agree. You don't have to think they're right. None of that. Although, I'll tell you, if they're opening up to you honestly, the probability that you will find what they're saying credible rapidly escalates. Because they don't tell you ideological idiocies of the sort that just anyone could bandy about. They tell you things only they know about their lives. And that sheds light on your own life, right? Because they've had experiences you haven't had and have come to construe things in ways you haven't and to solve problems that you haven't solved. And if you have a conversation, it's like you're starving for information. If you have a conversation with someone like you're starving for information, the probability is pretty high that you're going to have a good conversation. And the truth of the matter is you should be starving for information unless you have everything that you need. You should be thirsty for information. That's exactly it. So, and that's a fountain that never goes dry. And so that's very helpful and very interesting. Because it also means that wherever you go, you can get people to open up. It's effortful, and I wouldn't say you want to do it all the time, but you can do it when you want, and you get people to open up, and they'll tell you all sorts of strange and interesting things, and then that's unbelievably compelling. So I knew when I was conducting my therapy sessions properly because they were unbearably interesting. Like reading a great novel, you know. Well, a novel is obviously a description of the peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of a number of people's lives. It can be very engrossing. A movie can be like that. A play, these things that we do for entertainment. And we're happy to engross ourselves in someone else's story. You can get people to tell you their story, and then they get interesting. They're not telling you something that everyone else can tell you. It's their own peculiarity. It's like, wow, you're such a weird thing. You're such a weird thing. It's so crazy that you exist. And that all these weird things have happened to you and the conclusions that you've drawn. And, you know, it's very much fun. Rule 10. That's be precise in your speech. I tweeted out something the other day about this self-authoring program that I designed because part of it is a future authoring program. And what it has you do is sort of based on the idea that you can define the good life multidimensionally. When my clients come and see me and I want to find out how they're doing, one of the things I do is ask them, you know, which that gives me a first-person account of their own emotional state. And that's somewhat indicative of the quality of their life, but only, it's vaguely correlated. You know, you can have people who are manic and their lives are falling apart, but they're in a great mood, like they're really, really in a great mood. Positive emotion, you know, you say, well, you want to be happy. It's like, yeah, but you don't want to be too happy. Like, mania is no joke, and like a 1 month manic episode, you're done. You spend every cent you have and every cent you can get your hands on, because you're so enthusiastic about everything. You know, so a little positive emotion goes a long way. And that's a useful thing to know, because we don't really ever think that there are pathologies of positive emotion, but there definitely are. It's like, and you know, you get yourself in trouble when you get over enthusiastic. That's actually partly why people use the drugs they use, because they make them over enthusiastic. And that's a lot of fun, but it's obviously also very dangerous, because you get impulsive and you do foolish things when you're enthusiastic. You know, so, well, be that as it may. I tweeted out this future authoring program. What it does, it says, okay, well, make a plan for your life, and here's the rules. Treat yourself like you're someone that you're trying to set up a future for. So presume that you're worthwhile, and that you're caring for yourself, and that you're going to design a future for yourself 3 years from now that would be good for you. You know, if you were taking care of yourself, it's not exactly what you want. It's not that. It's you're taking care of yourself, and if you could design a future that would be good for someone like you, what would it look like? And then consider what do you want from an intimate relationship? What do you want from your friends? And also, what are you willing to give, obviously? How are you going to educate yourself or continue your education? What about your job or your career? What are you going to do with your time outside of work that's productive and engaging? How are you going to resist the common temptations that pull people down? That's a good initial array. Have a hypothesis about that. If you could have what you wanted, what would it be? It's an interesting question. It's especially interesting because you can't hit a target if you don't aim at it. And so I tweeted that. You can't hit a target if you don't aim at it. And I put the future authoring program up as a link. And I got more smart aleck comments than you could imagine, unless you were familiar with Twitter. You know, it's like, well, that's obvious. It's like, you know, I was accused of being a snake oil salesman and so forth and so on. And I thought, it's distressing to some degree, because we have good clinical evidence that this program really works, and it's helped thousands of people. So it's kind of boneheaded responses as far as I'm concerned. But it is. But the thing I said was obvious. Well, you can't hit a target if you don't aim at it. It's like, well, everyone knows that. It's like, no, you don't. No. You understand the phrase when someone utters it. That's not the same thing. Like I saw over and over in my clinical practice, this is unbelievably common. I would say it characterized not only my clients, who come across a wide swath of people, by the way, from unbelievably impaired in multiple dimensions to people who are functioning so well you could hardly believe it, like the whole gamut of people. And one of the things, and then my students for decades, and one of the things I noticed, and this was particularly true with my students, is they didn't have a plan for their life. They might have had some sense of what their job was going to be. And that was it. It was partly because no one had ever sat them down in their 18, 12, 15, 16 years of education and say, okay, what's up with you exactly? What would your life look like if you could have what you wanted that would be good for you? What are you going to do for friends? Like, what do you want for your friends exactly? You're going to do that consciously, or is that just going to happen accidentally? What about your intimate relationship? What do you want from that? Do you want a family? Do you have some plans for what you're going to do with your time, if you were going to use it as wisely as you possibly could? Have you sat down like for half an hour ever in your whole life and thought that through? No. It's a universal answer. No. And it's so amazing that we can educate students for 15 years, have them write on all sorts of topics, and never ever have them justify their vision for their development in the future. It's absolutely beyond comprehension that that's the case, but it is the case. And so, well, you can't hit a target if you don't aim at it. It's like, yeah, well, that's obvious. It's like, yeah, well, it might be obvious, but it doesn't mean that anybody does anything about it. And be precise in your speech. Well, what does that mean? Formulate, articulate an ideal. And the more precisely that's formulated and articulated, the higher the probability that it will actually come to pass. And it's not because it's magic. It's even better than magic. So here's a very cool thing. Your perceptions reveal the world to you in relationship to your goal. That's, the Buddhists say, this also comes from Hinduism, that the world is illusion, it's Maya. And that's because if you look at things one way, they look one way, and if you look at things another way, they look a different way. So there's an illusion aspect to it because you can flip the way the world is, depending, you know how it is. Maybe you're angry at your partner, and so then you see them through that lens. And you see it. It's not like you're thinking that. That's what you see. You see this annoying person who, and all you can remember is all the things they did in the past that annoyed you when you're angry. And then that disappears and you're back in love with them and you think, oh yeah, I love this person. It's like, what was up with that? And what was up with it is that your goal determines your perceptions. And this is, I'm telling you, this is another thing. So I told you one fundamental psychological truth, right? And that was, if you courageously confront something, you radically increase the probability that you will attain mastery over it. That's an optimistic thing. Another one is, your perceptions are dependent on your goals. And so that's another thing, too, that's worth thinking about. So if everything isn't manifesting itself in your life the way that you would like it to, one question is, maybe you're not aiming at the right thing. Because if you were aiming at something different, then what stood out as figure and what disappeared as ground would switch. And the reason for that is because your perception is actually a goal-directed mechanism, right? You need to do things in the world. You need to eat, you need to drink, you need to obtain shelter. Like, you have to zero in on a target and move towards it. You're always doing that. Whether you know it or not, the question is, well, what's your target? Well, you might have a proximal target. You know what you're doing today. But that's nested in some conception of next week and next month and a year from now. It's nested in some conception of your future self. It's nested in some conception of your responsibility to other people. That might be all implicit because you've never articulated and thought it through, but it's bloody well there. And if, while you're living in that value hierarchy, that structure, everything that's manifesting itself to you is negative, it's certainly possible that that structure isn't very well organized. You're a house divided amongst itself. You're not founded on rock, you're founded on sand. And so, to formulate a vision for yourself that's precise radically increases the probability that you'll be able to, well, that you'll be able to identify where it is that you should go and plot your course for getting there. So that's, and this is, and then the precision part, this is also associated to some degree with Rule 8, which is tell the truth or at least don't lie. So, the precision part, I mean, the higher the resolution your map, the less time you're going to waste traversing the territory. The fewer things you're going to encounter that are unexpected obstacles. And so, making that precise is extremely useful. And then, the precision also, it also increases the probability that you'll, how to put that exactly? If you force yourself to think something through precisely, then there's far fewer places you can hide the things that you don't want to face. That's the right way to put it. That's Rule 10. That's worth knowing. Oh yes, that's why you have to be so careful with what you say. You know, because in the final analysis, you articulate your value structure. You use your communicative ability to do that. And then if you warp that, like if you use your communicative ability to deceive or to manipulate other people, say, you do the same to yourself. Because you can't formulate articulated, you can't communicate in a deceptive manner without pathologizing, I already mentioned this, without pathologizing your own psyche. And so what that means is that you have to be very, very careful with what you say and what you write, and also with how you act. But we could start with that. You don't want to say words that you don't believe to be true. Because you call things into being that you don't want to have exist if you do that. Because you call things into being as a consequence of speaking. And this is way more true than you think. And so it's very necessary to be very careful with your words, because they're what transforms the potential of the future into the actuality of the present. And you live in that, and the actuality of the past, for that matter. Right? Confront potential. That's what you do as a conscious creature. And you confront that, at least in part, with the ability to communicate. And the patterns of your communication determine how that potentiality manifests itself. So that's a very, very deep idea, that idea. That's the part of you that participates in the ongoing creation from nothing, fundamentally. That's part of your divine value, let's say. And that's something that's very much worth knowing as well. no other children when they're skateboarding.
Woo!
So let's say we've already established a variety of propositions. One is that the world is a place of suffering, it's dangerous, and it's also a place of malevolence, not least as a consequence of your inactions and actions. And that's what your children are going to confront. You know, and that's a serious enough problem so that one of the questions that torments potential mothers is whether or not it's an ethical act to bring a child into a world like this. Now, it's a strange question because the world as it's presently constituted is actually a better world than any one that's existed so far. But still, it might give you second thoughts. You know, it's like, well, what's it going to be like for my child in the future? Is it really acceptable to bring a new being into existence? And so, do grapple with this problem. It's not a trivial problem. And maybe you grapple with that in other ways too, because there'll be times in your life where things have gone so dreadfully sideways that you think that it might be better if you didn't exist at all. And it's a very rare person who hasn't thought that at some desperate moment. And some people think that all of the time. And there's reasons to think that, because life is very hard. It's a fatal, what is it? It's a 100% fatal sexually transmitted disease. That's the most pessimistic definition of life I've ever heard. The man who ran the biggest psychiatric hospital in Montreal for like 50 years told me that joke. God, I never got it out of my head. He was a very good guy, and so he could tolerate a joke like that. Well, so okay, so that's the baseline. It's like, okay, well, that's the reality that we confront. Well, what are you going to do about that with regards to your children? And one answer is make them safe. It's like, good luck with that. You haven't been able to do it for you. I don't know why you think you'd be able to do it for them. And then there's the possibility that you'll turn into their worst enemy by trying to make things too safe around them. You know, there's a rule of thumb for dealing with people in old folks' homes, if you're working in one. Don't do anything for your clients that they can do themselves. You think, well, the merciful person who's overflowing with compassion does everything she or he can possibly do for the elderly people. It's like, no, if they can struggle through tying their shoes, leave them be. Because every time you move forward to take away that autonomy, all you do is destroy what they have left for the future. It's exactly the same with kids, right? The psychoanalysts, they're very smart. Freud, for example, because he was very attuned to the Oedipal situation, which is overdependence in a family, and the pathology that produces. It's like he said, the successful mother necessarily fails. Right, so that's a good, because by the time your children are 30, say, maybe you're not mom anymore. You know, you are, obviously, because your mother is always your mother, but by the time your children are adults, there should be some parity of relationship. Right, and maybe you'd even hope that by the time you're 70, your kids are, well, able to take care of you a little bit, which at least should hypothetically mean that they're full-fledged autonomous adults. Hopefully that would be the case. You know, so the power balance shifts across time, or the competence balance. And what you're trying to do with your kids is make them as autonomous and self-sufficient and competent and practical as you possibly can, as rapidly as possible. And so you have to pull back from that state of infantile union. You know, that's the right state for the first 6 months of life. Say, well, you know, when your kid is learning to walk, you let them bump their head. You let them stand up underneath a table once or twice, and then they'll never do it again because the table doesn't move up and down and suddenly becomes soft. It's like it's always hard. And so the way the kid deals with that is never stands up underneath it. That's a good metaphor for the rules that you lay down in the family as well. Not too many, but they don't move. And then the children can learn to avoid them, and then they don't even bump into the rules. They're just like part of the furniture. So you pull back as your child matures, and you encourage them to take necessary risks. And the question is, well, what's a necessary risk? And the answer is, whatever the risk the child is capable of taking. And you have to calibrate that with each kid. You know, I watched my daughter when she was young learn how to climb the monkey bars. It was quite interesting watching her. There's some monkey bars in our backyard. And she would climb up. And then when she got a little higher than she was like comfortable with tolerating, she'd do this. She'd move her foot. And she'd move it a little higher, and she'd move it a little higher, and then she'd take the step, and then she'd do the same with the next foot. Right? Very, very careful testing of limits, you know. And what what you can do in a situation like that is you can wait till she's just about ready to take the step, and you can run out in a fit of compassion and say, be careful! And if you're really fortunate, she'll fall off and run in the house and hug you, and then she'll be a year less mature than she might be, and you'll still have your damn infant. Had parents like that, yeah, and still do. It's not a good thing. So you have to encourage your children. That's how you make them safe, is you encourage them. And that means you make them courageous. And that's what they have in life, is courage. That's the best protection against the danger of life. Because there's more to people than meet the eye, and if they're forthright and they're willing to take on the obligation of being the responsibility, then they can discover within themselves what's necessary in order to prevail despite the danger of the world. And that's the only safety there is. And maybe that's the only safety we want. I don't even know what life would be like if it was safe. Right? You want an adventure, you want something to contend with and confront. I mean, what would life be without that? There has to be the danger. Well, so if there has to be the danger, then, well, what do you do about that? And the answer is, well, you go for mastery, you don't go for safety. And so, you know, I watched kids skateboard in front of the building that I worked in, and mostly boys, and do crazy things, like things that I would just die if I ever did them. You know, like they slide down the bars of the stairs to the handrails, which is, that's bad. You know what happens if you fall off those? It's not good. And they fell off them all the time. And then they'd laugh and roll around on the ground in agony and laugh and poke fun at each other, and then back on their skateboards they go. And you think, how can you be so dumb? And the answer is, well, the answer is simple. It's like mastery now will save a lot of trouble in the future. And so when you see people testing the limits and pushing the limits, I mean, there's some danger associated with that. It's not like there isn't some stupidity at times too, and maybe you can rein that in to some degree, although God only knows how much stupidity is necessary. You know, when it's accompanied by a certain amount of daring. If you're courageous as a parent, then you shut your mouth when your child's taking a necessary risk. And that's a very hard thing to do. It really takes courage. And if you can't do it, it's not because you're compassionate, it's because you're cowardly. That's the truth of the matter. You might say, well, I'm not cowardly, I just care. It's like, yeah, the best mask for cowardice is an excess of compassion. That's something everyone should learn again, especially the damn universities. So, I won't tell you Rule 12 because I'm out of time, but I'll tell you Rule 13 because I promised I would. That was what this whole damn lecture was supposed to be about. But I guess I wasn't ready for it yet. So, Rule 13 was, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. Yes. And so, I like that. And responsibility, I said already, that's a response, right? So that's interesting. That something calls out to you in the world and you respond to it if you're responsible. And so, because we tend to think of responsibility as something like a crushing duty, let's say, or maybe we think about it when we're trying to be to pursue impulsive pleasure and freedom. We think about responsibility as a trap or a prison or a crushing weight, something like that. But it's not that. It's that. And then opportunity. I looked that up to the etymology of that word. Opportunity is the wind that blows you into a port. That's off port. That's the port part of the word. So that's very cool, I think, because it implies if there's a linking between responsibility and opportunity, which there is that to accept responsibility is to simultaneously find a port, a harbor. And I think this is so cool. This is one of the things that I've had such fun talking to people about as I've been lecturing all over the place for the last 7 or 8 months. One of the things that psychologists have done a bad job of, I would say, over the last 50 years or so, is we haven't been able to point out to people that, well, first that you need a meaning that will sustain you in life. You have to be pessimistic about that. Life is hard. We start with that. Everyone agrees. Everyone knows that. Okay, what are you going to do about that? Run away. No. If you run away, the harder, the thing that's confronting you gets larger and you get smaller. It's a very, very bad plan. It doesn't work, so that's not the answer. Okay, so you turn around and you confront the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and merely by turning around, then you become larger and it becomes smaller. And then you move forward and the same thing happens. You grow and it shrinks. And God only knows the limit to that. Because people can take on unbelievable burdens and prevail. And by people, I mean us. Everyone can do that. And you see that in normative behavior all the time. People work in emergency wards, for example, and they can do it. It's unbelievable. Every day they go up to work. That's your life. You get up to work and you go have a bunch of emergencies. And you can do that. Yes, and you can do that. And that shows you that there's more to you than you think. And thank God for that. Say, well, what is it? Imagine that in front of you, you're irritated and annoyed because things aren't what they should be. Because someone isn't living up to what they should be living up to. Society isn't what it should be, and your family isn't what it should be. And there's something about you that bothers you, right? That's what makes you resentful and bitter. Because you're not getting what you promised. That's the victim mentality, let's say. It's like, well, wait a second. You're missing something. It's like, if it bothers you, then there's something there to be set right. Because you wouldn't be annoyed otherwise, right? You think it should be this way, and it's this way. And so that means there's an ideal there that's manifesting itself. And what you're reacting to is the absence of that ideal. Well, then if you have the ideal, think, okay, well, why am I annoyed about that? It's because, well, things should be set in this particular order. This is how the world should be manifesting itself in order for things to be proper. It's like when you think, well, I need a meaning in my life, or I need to figure out what to do. It's like, well, there you've got it right in front of you. It's like if it's bothering you that things aren't the way they should be, then you could go try to put them right. You could do whatever was necessary to make yourself into the person that could do that. Well, that would give you something to do. That's the opportunity. You know, I've coached lots of people in their business life. They're annoyed because their co-workers won't do their job properly, or their boss won't do their job properly, and look, fair enough. And I'm not saying that you should be a martyr and sacrifice yourself so that someone else can take the credit. I think that's foolish. But if you're in a situation and a lot of things are laying around undone, you might ask yourself, well, what would happen if you did them? Well, I can't. Okay, what would happen if you built yourself into the sort of person who could? Well, first of all, you become invaluable. If you want to become invaluable in a workplace, that's a great way to do it. Just go do all the things that absolutely need to be done that no one else is doing. I mean, you're instantly, no one can move you. You're at linchpin unless the whole business wants to fail, and sometimes that happens, and then you should leave, obviously. But under any reasonable circumstances, by picking up the excess responsibility, that's an opportunity to become absolutely invaluable. And then if you want to negotiate for a raise, let's say, or for more autonomy, you can go to your boss and say, hey, look, here's 10 things that are absolutely vital that I noticed needed to be done, and I'm doing all of them. It's like, I'll do a bunch more of those if you help me out a little bit. And then if your boss has any sense, it's, sometimes he does, and sometimes he needs to make a case to his superiors. He says, look, this person has put their finger on the linchpins here and is an integral part of the organization. And, we should do everything we can to keep him. And maybe not only that, we should do what we can to facilitate his ability to take on even more responsibility. And things do work that way. Well, so that's Rule 13. So I'm writing the next book, and I'm trying to work these things out, and that's one of the rules I want to include, and I thought it would be good to talk to you about it today. It took me a little while to get warmed up. That's okay. I got some of it out. I do believe that you find the meaning in your life through adopting responsibility. And I think that you find enough meaning to be pleased about the fact that things exist if you accept enough responsibility. And that doesn't just work psychologically because it gives you something worthwhile to do, although that's a big deal, right? I mean, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And I think, I've never met anyone who doesn't believe that's true. People can look back in their life and they think, well, I did that, it was worthwhile. Was it easy? No, because worthwhile things are rarely easy. It's a strange thing, that there's some reciprocal relationship between the worth of something and its difficulty. It's almost a justification for difficulty. It's like, well, it better be difficult because otherwise it won't be worthwhile. Do you want difficulty? No, I want ease. It's like, well, is doing something easy worthwhile? Well, not very often. Well, then maybe you want something difficult. I actually think that's the secret to the reason for being. Is that difficulty was necessary. There's this old idea, a lovely idea, It's an amazing idea. I don't know how old it is. So you take the attributes of a being with the classical attributes of God: omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. What does it lack? Well, what kind of question is that? By definition, it lacks nothing. It's omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. What does it lack? Limitation. Right? That's why God created human beings. Because there's something worthwhile in limitation. And maybe what's worthwhile is the transcending of the limitation thing. And it's such a lovely thought, you know. It's so interesting, because one of the things we even do for entertainment is put limitations on ourselves. Go play a game online, it's like you narrow yourself, right? You're in the game, there's a bunch of arbitrary rules, that's what makes the game. It's not fun without the arbitrary rules. Those are limitations and difficulties. You take them on voluntarily. This is fun. It's like, I can only move this chess man in an L. Well, why is that? Well, because it's not any fun if you can just move it anywhere. If you move all the pieces anywhere all the time, it's no game. Put on some limitations, man. The game's on. Then you think, well, then how to play the limited game properly? It's like, accept the limitations. Accept them as a necessary part of being, and a desirable part, and then assume that you can transcend them by accepting them. That seems to be true. Thank you very much.
But this is Jordan's computer, and I have the password now. And he's logged into Twitter. I could end it all tonight. You know what I mean? Should I do that or bring him out? What do you think? All right. Jordan Peterson, everybody.
Twitter, Dave. I'm sure I'll do that for myself.
Well, should we start there then? Is there anything else you want to say on this Kavanaugh thing? Because you've been getting all that crap on it, so I know you're going to write a blog post.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd like to say, and I'm going to start a blog post with this, it's sort of in relation. So I said, I tweeted out, Eric Weinstein, who's a nominal part of this intellectual dark web, said that as far as he was concerned, all the outcomes of this Supreme Court nomination process were going to be bad because it was such a mess. And he asked if there was any alternatives. And so I thought about it for a while. I thought, well, Kavanaugh could be nominated, and that would clear his name to the degree that it will ever be cleared. And this is completely independent of his guilt or innocence, by the way. I'm not making any comments on that at all. But he's in a terrible mess. And I thought, well, he can be cleared and then pass the nomination on to someone else. And so then maybe the Republicans could come up with a candidate who held Kavanaugh's views, roughly speaking, but who isn't at the center of this terrible and pernicious scandal. And so, well, that's an option. And then, you know, I mentioned earlier, and then I got a lot of negative comments about that. And then, you know, I mentioned earlier that if you're having a fight with your wife, you can go into your room and you can think of what stupid thing you get that increased the probability that that would happen. And so that's what I did, and I thought, oh yes, well, don't say things like that on Twitter. So I talked to my son about this like 2 months ago, and 3 months ago, and 4 months ago, and he said, Dad, if you have something complicated to say, write a blog post, don't tweet it. Yes. But Twitter, you know, it rewards impulsivity, and it was like 1 in the morning, and I was reading this, and I thought, well, here's an idea. It's like, don't put ideas on Twitter. So, start the blog post with a mea culpa, which is, well, you know, I shouldn't have used Twitter because it's not the right vehicle for this sort of discussion. And then, well, then I also want to discuss the fact that just because I had that idea doesn't mean it's right. Like, I don't know what's right in this situation, you know. I mean, a lot of people who objected to what I said, well, you tell people not to apologize and you tell them not to back down, and isn't that the same as asking them to back down? It's like, well, you can make that case. That's a reasonable point. I could be wrong about it, you know. Maybe the right thing for him to do is to accept the nomination and to move forward. But there's so much division associated with it. It seems to me that it's going to be a rough haul, and I can't see any way out of this situation where every what would you call it, disputable decision that the Supreme Court makes from now on is going to be the centerpiece of tremendous unrest. And so I would have thought, well, if I was in Kavanaugh's position, believe me, I am not saying this is right, because I don't know what's right. And thank God we have a democratic way of sorting this out, right? Because we let the majority make the decisions and suffer for its mistakes. That's the definition of democracy. And so I'm perfectly happy. Well, that is it, right? Democracy is the right to be punished for your own stupidity. So maybe you can learn something that way. Maybe that's why the system works, you know, because it doesn't mean you're right, but it means at least you get to have your opinion and you get to see what happens. And if it's stupid and horrible, then maybe you cannot be so stupid and horrible the next time. And so that's something. So anyways, I don't know if this is right, but I thought that sometimes maybe you have to put the broader national interest first. And it doesn't matter if it's Kavanaugh specifically who's on the Supreme Court. You know what I mean? I mean, there's a way it matters, obviously. But I can't see how his candidacy is irreparably tarnished. I know I'm not saying that that's just. It's not the point. The point is perhaps it would be more in the national interest for a candidate whose nomination was surrounded by less contention to move forward. Now you could say, it doesn't matter. The Republicans put forward the next candidate, it's just as bloody horrible. But that would also be interesting to see, if it would be just as horrible, because that would be more evidence. So, anyways, what's the moral of the story? Don't say complicated things in one sentence on Twitter.
Rule 14, delete Twitter.
Yeah, well, I wonder about that. Like, that's another thing I've really been thinking about, and I don't know. Like, I have like 900,000 Twitter followers, and so I don't know what to do about that. It's like, because well, and neither does anybody else. It's like, let's say you're on a social media platform and you have a whole bunch of followers. It's like, well, can you just quit doing it? I mean, is that okay? Because I think about that. I think maybe it would be better if I just didn't use Twitter ever again. And maybe it would be, but then there's 900,000 people that are following me, so then I think, well, maybe I have a moral obligation to try to use it properly. And so I'm trying to learn how to use it properly and to figure out what properly means. And I think it would be easier in some sense to just delete it. Okay, well, let's do this. Let's try this, just out of curiosity, so if you would indulge me for a moment. Clap, please, if you would. How many people think that I should keep using Twitter? That's some people. How many people think I should stop using Twitter?
One other key question here. How many of you are pink anime foxes?
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily expected that. And I presume you're doing that with my best interest in mind. Or perhaps your best interest, or perhaps you just hate Twitter. How many people who think I should stop using Twitter are still using Twitter? All right, so some people for sure.
Oh, this is actually a great segue. to remain calm and reserved in order to keep your composure?
Well, when I wrote Rule 5, okay, first of all, one of the things that you learn as a clinical psychologist is to be detached. So when people are trained to be a clinical psychologist, everyone has the same question. The question is, because they're usually reasonably compassionate people, and the question is, they ask these to the more senior clinicians, how is it that people can tell you all the terrible things that are going on in their life, and then you can go home and not have that eat you up? And the answer is, if you're rescuing someone who's drowning, it doesn't help if you drown too. So that's part of the answer, right? So you actually have a moral obligation not to be taken down. But then there's another element of it, which is, one of the things you have to remember, this is also true if you're a parent, you don't get to steal the problems of those you care for. They're their problems, not yours. And if you, so for example, if you're a clinical psychologist, maybe someone's wrestling with a difficult problem and you think, oh God, I've got the solution, and you give them the solution. It's like, well, even if it's a good solution, it's not theirs. So you've just stolen the possibility that that person could come up with their own solution from them. And that's a terrible theft. You know, because your problems are your destiny, and you don't want to steal someone's destiny. So you have to leave them with their problems. And then that also helps you, because you can say, well, look, you've got your problems, and it isn't morally obligatory that I suffer myself to death over them. In fact, it's not helpful. It might even make you worse, because then not only do you have your problems, but you're sinking everyone around you with them. You want to at least be able to talk to one person who your burdens won't sink. And so you also have a moral obligation as a clinician to not be taken down by your client's problems. And it's the same with your children. So now you have to tell me the question again, Dave.
The question was, how do you keep your composure?
Oh yes, okay, so you learn that. You learn to detach and watch. And so that's one thing. You learn to detach and watch. And then the next thing is, I already knew the doctrine. The doctrine is minimal necessary force. And that's kind of like turn the other cheek. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's very close. It's like, do not react to provocation more than what is minimally effective. It works way better, and I've seen this dozens and dozens of times. I can tell you some things if you get mobbed. Okay, so here's what to do. The first thing is, do not apologize unless you've done something wrong. And even if you have done something wrong, be very, very careful about apologizing, because the mob that comes after you for whatever you've done is not the same mob that comes after you when you apologize, but they're both mobs. And you don't care, because you don't care if it's one group of 300 people with a pitchfork or another group. It's still a group of 300 people with pitchforks. So, okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you can stick it out for 2 weeks, it'll be over. But it's an intense 2 weeks, man, and it's going to be rough. The third thing is, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And what I've observed every single time so far, thank God, every time that someone has come after me, that I've been able to maintain my composure, it's flipped. Every single time. So, after a while, you observe that and you think, okay, it's upsetting in the moment, but the moment isn't the full reality. And what you're interested in is making sure that the full reality manifests itself in the best possible manner. And so then you can detach yourself from the moment. You know, I was just reviewing a video the other day when I was at McMaster University, and there was 2 demonstrations that I was in the middle of that were particularly ugly. McMaster University. And when I watched it again, I just couldn't believe it. It's just surreal. And Queen's University were in this hall that was sort of like a church. It was lined with stained glass windows, and there's about 900 people in there that I was talking to, and the protesters climbed up onto the stained glass windows and beat against them for like an hour and a half non-stop, and barricaded the doors, and one of them said, barricade the doors and burn it down. It's like, it's not amusing, that was a favorite trick of the Nazis in the Second World War. It's not a comment that I took particularly well. And so it was surreal, that whole experience, you know. But at McMaster, I thought, this is part of what's happening, but it's by no means everything. We'll just maintain our composure. The only thing I did, the only intervention I undertook was, there was two people behind me, and the guy in particular was, there are people that are looking for trouble. And in the mobs that have confronted me, most of them are just foolish young people who have had nonsense drilled into their heads by even more foolish older people. Usually they're professors. And but sprinkled in with the generic protesters are one person out of 20 who would just absolutely be in his element. It's usually a he, if things went seriously sideways, and I can usually pick those people up. And there was one of them behind me with a girl, and they were blowing an air horn, and they were definitely blowing it close enough to me to do damage, and they definitely knew it. And so I had a talk with them. I told them that if they continued to do that, I would get the police and have them arrested, because I'm not interested in permanent hearing damage, and I knew what they were up to. But other than that, I just let it go, and it's better if you can do it, if you can maintain your composure. Every time, my success has been proportionate to the degree that I've been able to maintain my composure. And so that's a good thing to know in your life, you know. It's like minimal necessary force. Man, it's a great principle. It's a fundamental principle of English common law. It's a really good principle. And it's high stakes, you know. How can you maintain your composure? Make a mistake and perish. That's a good rule if you want to maintain your composure. So keep yourself together, because if you make a mistake, the outcome is not going to be good. And I would say that there are times in your life where you see that exaggerated, and that's definitely been the case in my life almost every day for the last 2 years. But it's also true in the more normal milieu of your own life. It's just muted in some sense. So, yeah.
Sometimes, do you pray, and do you see any value in prayer?
Well, you know that technique I told you about, trying to figure out where you're at fault? That's a prayer, for all intents and purposes. It works. You know, there's a New Testament line, knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive. It's embedded in a much larger set of ideas, by the way, but the thing about that statement is it's true. But the conditions, there are conditions that have to be met. That's, if I remember correctly, I think I do, that's part of the Sermon on the Mount. And there's an idea in the Sermon on the Mount about how to live, and the idea is basically twofold. One is, aim at the highest ideal that you can conceive of. That's rule one. So that's associated with the idea of falling into alignment with God, I suppose. And the second is to tell the truth. So those are the two preconditions. Aim at the highest value that you can conceive of and tell the truth. Then concentrate on the day. That's very, very good advice. Orient yourself properly, then pay attention moment to moment in your life. That really works. That's sufficient unto the day are the troubles thereof. It's right. But that assumes that you've oriented yourself properly. Right? Because what happens, this is a matter of, say, being precise in your speech. You specify your goal, and then that orients your perceptions. And once they're oriented, then you can use your oriented perceptions to maximize your concentration on the day. And then you can make every little thing go right. And if you make every little thing go right, then everything goes right. That works. Well, part of that is you can get what you want if you ask for it. Well, okay, but what does that mean? What does it mean? Well, the first question is, well, what does it mean that you want it? Because most of the time when you want something, you sort of want it. And if you sort of want it, you're not going to get it. So what does it mean to want it? It means to bet your bloody life on it. Because you stake your life on something because you don't have a choice. You guys are all staking your life on your life because you're going to lose your life. So this is an all-in game. So do you want something? What do you mean want? Would you stake everything on it? Because you don't want it if you won't stake everything on it. Well, will you get what you want if you stake everything on it? Well, perhaps you will, but you won't find out unless you stake everything on it. That's part of the reason that there's an emphasis on the necessity for courage and faith. Right? Because you don't know what can work before you play the game. So, will you get something if you ask for it? It depends on what you want. It depends on what you're willing to sacrifice for it, and it depends on how you ask. And if you ask, how is it that I'm insufficient in a way that I could rectify? You will absolutely get an answer. And so that's how prayer works. And that works. If you think it's a matter of asking God for favors, well, I shouldn't be a smart aleck about that. You know, that's not, in my opinion, and in my experience, that's not how it works. You can get what you want if what you want is what you should want. And what you should want is to know what's wrong with you that you could rectify. And you will figure that out so fast. It's easy. You just try it. Go at home, sit on the edge of your bed and think, okay, it's confession. I know I'm a damn fool. All right, and I'm probably doing some stupid things that I know about, that I could change, that I would change. What might they be? But you have to want to know the answer. And you won't want to know the answer because you won't like the answer. So it's really hard to get yourself in the state of mind where you want the answer. Because you won't like it. So that's the other thing. You have to want an answer that you won't like. And then you think, well, how can you put yourself in a situation where that's possible? Well, that's easy. It's like fear will do that. It's like, it's not good that you're making mistakes. You will pay for them. One of the things I've learned as a clinical psychologist that makes me just shudder to think this, I've never seen anyone ever get away with anything. Never. And so, you're not going to get away with anything. And so if you know that, you think, I'm not going to get away with anything. Really? And you've got to get rid of your arrogance before you believe that, because everyone thinks, oh yeah, well I can just get away with this one thing. It's like, no you can't. What did you say? Well, I can bend the structure of reality to suit me this one way, and all the physical laws of the universe will rearrange themselves to make that happen. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. You bend the fabric of reality, it will snap back and take you out. For sure that will happen. And so if you know that, and you know that the probability that something is going to snap back and take you out is proportionate to your unnecessary stupidity, and you actually know that, then you can want to have that revealed. But there's terror that has to be associated with it. You have to think, my God, I got to straighten this out. Like my soul depends on it. Straightening this out. I need to see where I'm wrong. I need to see where I'm wrong. It's like, you'll figure it out. It's not pleasant. But you could ask in a gentler way. You could say, I'd like to discover something about what I'm doing wrong that isn't so overwhelming that it'll break me. Yeah. That's optimistic, eh?
I wish you guys all had the opportunity to have Jordan stare directly in your eyes. Are you getting sick of steak yet?
That's a good question. Look, I hate to talk about my health and my diet, but I will, I guess. When I started this diet, because I have a variety of health problems, and my daughter seems to have inherited them, and then a bunch more as well. So she straightened hers out, and then I started doing some of the things that she learned were helpful. When I first started doing this, it looked like I was so sensitive to most of what I ate that I couldn't eat in restaurants at all. And that was not good. How the hell do you travel then? And then it turned out that I could eat steaks, say. That's as long as I didn't have anything put on them and they were careful. Then I could travel. And so now when I go into a restaurant, I think, thank God I can go into this restaurant. Because being able to go in and have something is so much better than not being able to go in at all, that they're not even comparable. Now, it's dull as can be. Like, I mean, I'm a good cook. I love cooking. I cooked in restaurants when I was a kid. I've got a very good nose for spices. Like, I like to make fancy dishes. I really miss a diverse range of food, but I'll tell you, being able to eat something beats the hell out of being able to eat nothing. So, and that's good enough. And I mean, there's all sorts of other things in my life that are going insanely and spectacularly well. And so, you know, you can't focus on the one thing that isn't everything it could be, and when everything else is crazily rife with opportunity. But I'm not actually that sick of steak. Like, if you had to pick just one thing to eat, you know, it could be worse. It could be an eggplant.
We went out to Reed Chris the other night, and you got the tomahawk that could feed like 7 families. And you freaking...
It's like 40 ounces. You
burn
a lot of energy doing these sorts of talks. So yeah. No, it's okay. It's okay. I can, like, thank God things have set up so that I can travel around and do this, because so it's fine. It's fine. And, you know, the other thing is that that's what my daughter eats, and she is healthy. And that's absolutely beyond comprehension.
Maybe for the rest of the tour we'll do this Rogan style. We'll just get like a carcass and we'll just eat out of the truck. Alright, unfortunately we only have time for one more. I think this is kind of an interesting place to stop. At what point is leave or let go the best choice other than to confront someone in tough situations? For example, being a conservative student on college campuses. Let me just throw in the towel.
Well, I don't think you definitely resist if you're being called upon to falsify your own account of your own experience. So that's when you have to fight, because it's better to fight than to capitulate under those circumstances. The risk is lower, because there isn't anything worse than anyone can do to you than to force you to falsify your own experience. They're leading you down the garden path to insanity. So if the requirement is you must write this in this manner, in this ideological manner, the answer to that is under no circumstances whatsoever will I do that. So that's sort of the line in the sand, let's say. And then the rest of it depends on the particularities of the situation. So it's hard to give generic advice. I would say, if you can walk away from a conflict without compromising yourself, then you should. That's a good rule of thumb. It's what people learn when they learn martial arts, right? It's like, let's say you're a great fighter. Well, that doesn't mean you fight every time you're presented with the opportunity. It means that if you can defuse and walk away, then you do so. But if you have to fight, then you're ready. Right? So that's an important thing. So, what do they say? Discretion is the better part of valor. That's a very good rule of thumb. If you're a university student, the reason that you're going to university is to learn how to articulate yourself and to articulate the world. And you have a sacred duty to do that. Society has built these great institutions. You're sheltered from most obligations, except that one, for 4 years. You can learn to express yourself more clearly and to think and to contemplate the deep truths of existence. And that's what you should be doing at university. And if anyone interferes with that, then and you have to compromise yourself in order to go along, then you don't do it. Because you do yourself too much damage that way. Students say, well, you know, I need the grades, I'll just give the teacher what he wants. It's like, that's not a good idea, because you cannot write an essay that you don't believe without coming to believe what you write. You think that you're immune to your own propaganda. You aren't. And the evidence for that is quite clear, by the way, because if you test if you have people write an essay that's counter-attitudinal, that violates their stated beliefs, and then you test them later, their beliefs shift in the direction of the essay. So you are not immune to your own propaganda. That's a wonderful thing to know. So don't generate it unless you want your psychological structure to be fabricated from propaganda. And then you're the equivalent of a totalitarian state. So that's the bad, unless you want to be the equivalent of a totalitarian state, which seems to me like not a very intelligent goal given their eventual, given how they end up in flames with everyone suffering, it's not a good idea. So walk away, except when you can't, and when you can't, then you tell the truth. So that's basically that, as far as I can tell.
That seems like the right way to end this. What do you think, guys?